Good afternoon, and welcome to the session on Asperger syndrome and the transition to adulthood, considerations for success. I am extremely passionate about this topic, and I think there's just so much research that still needs to be done in this area to provide supports for individuals becoming adults and individuals who already are adults on the with Asperger syndrome or on the autism spectrum. I have an adult son who's 35 and is having tremendous challenges right now, maintaining employment in different areas, has a lot of really positive skills and has had many successes in his life, and yet still has some challenges. And so this is an area near and dear to my heart. I'd like to begin first with a little agenda. I'm going to talk about perspectives of adults with high-functioning autism and Asperger syndrome, because who else to better tell us about what it's like and what their challenges are and what their strengths are than people with Asperger syndrome and high-functioning autism. So I'm going to give you a little bit of their perspectives and some quotes from some individuals that I've had the pleasure of meeting. And then also talk about the transition to adulthood, specifically what are some of the necessary college skills and the necessary employment skills. And if you're watching this and you're having a young child that you're focusing on with autism or Asperger syndrome, this would still be an important webcast to listen to, because a lot of the things that are going to be necessary for adulthood really need to start to be taught when the child is young. It's hard to just start to teach these when they become an adult, so this really would apply to all ages. So first we're going to look at some of the perspectives of individuals with Asperger syndrome and high-functioning autism and what they can tell us about this. Luke Jackson, who wrote Freaks, Geeks, and Asperger Syndrome, when he was 13 years old, he has Asperger syndrome, said that for teenagers with Asperger syndrome, quote, deciphering other kids' message meanings is harder than deciphering ancient hieroglyphics. He just had a really difficult time with that. And Luke is quite bright, quite intelligent, but that whole social component was just overwhelming. And then there was a book I read recently by Valerie Gause, who, her book was about cognitive behavioral therapy for adults with Asperger syndrome. Quite interesting book, because there really isn't much information out on mental health treatment and counseling for individuals with high-functioning autism and Asperger syndrome. Till her book came out, and she was focusing on how cognitive behavioral therapy really is evidence-based strategy for this population. Also, a lot of the resources that I have here on the slides that you're going to be seeing and listening to, I have the resources on the slides in the back. So when you print out your PowerPoint, you'll have those resources as well. And what she said in her book was, one adult commented, "When I'm around a group of people, I always feel like I have come into a room where everyone is playing a game that they already know, but I don't. And I want to enter the game, but nobody will stop and tell me what the rules are." And I've actually had other individuals and teens tell me the same thing. That's what it feels like. I don't know how to enter your world. I don't know what's going on. And a lot of that applies to, we just have a lot of hidden curriculum rules or things that are unspoken and that we just kind of learn. It seems like through osmosis or something, but individuals on the autism spectrum don't learn that without being explicitly taught. Claire Sansbury wrote a book called Martian in the Playground, and she talks about her experience. In fact, she actually teaches individuals on the spectrum now. She herself has Asperger syndrome. And she said, "Our distinctive learning styles can cause problems in interpreting language." Another quote was, "We are usually highly pedantic and literal," almost talking, not everybody, but in a college professorial type way, and extremely literal. So sometimes miss expressions. If you said to them, "Oh, get out of here," we might be meaning, "Oh, you're kidding," and the person might think, "Oh my gosh, you really want me to leave, get out of here." She also said, "We view the world in black and white with little ability to register or tolerate ambiguity. Gosh. In other words, seeing the gray area is very, very challenging. And life is so much of the gray area." And then she said, "I never had the chance to see other people make the same social mistakes as me when I was mainstreamed." I don't think this means we shouldn't mainstream, and certainly we should be doing inclusion, but I just thought that was a really interesting perspective, that she had been in inclusion and mainstream classes her whole life, so she never saw anybody make a lot of the social faux pas she did. and where she stood out. It was just kind of an interesting perspective that she shared. Temple Grandin, I recently saw her again and had the chance to talk with her very, very briefly at a conference in, it was in April in McLean, Virginia. And she said, quote, "My mind works like Google for images." And you know, as she's talked about in many of her books, that she thinks in pictures. Not everybody with autism or Asperger syndrome does. In fact, my son actually has trouble visualizing and planning visual in that manner, so it's not indicative of everybody. And she says, if I don't have a picture, I just don't have a thought. And then she said, quote, "Autistic thinking is specific to general." And then she says, "But many of you neurotypicals, or people who aren't on the autism spectrum, really think from general to specific." And she said, "A mentor teacher makes all the difference." And she credits so much her science teacher for really getting her involved in celebrating her strengths. And that became her lifelong pursuit in working with animals and creating slaughter chutes and all the different things in the designs she does. And she, quote, you'll hear her say over and over again, "A teacher is worth their weight in gold." And really that it's really key that we find whatever that interest is for that person and help them to build a career and hobby around it. And she says, "I am what I think and do more than what I feel." She has a difficult time with feelings and emotions, and she really talks about her identity is through her work and what she does. And then, of course, she added in, "You can be eccentric, and it's okay, but you cannot be a slob." And there she goes back to a lot of her specific rules, black and white rules on what's appropriate and not, and that just having autism or Asperger syndrome is not a reason for doing something inappropriate or for being sloppy, that we still need to follow certain social rules. She and Sean Barron have written Unwritten Rules of Social Relationships, Decoding Social Mysteries through the Unique Perspectives of Autism. And it was really interesting that Future Horizons asked them to write this book. They commented because they have some social challenges, certainly, and but who better to write it than they've actually learned to compensate and to deal with some of these things and to create situations in some sense, sometimes when they maybe can avoid things that are too difficult, but then also compensate and be able to participate in social situations when necessary. So I would recommend this as a resource. In it, she talks about 10 unwritten rules of things that you and I just take for granted, but that she had to learn. In other words, to learn to be a little more flexible, to know that rules are truly situation and person-specific. They don't apply in every single situation. And other advice about not everyone who's nice to you is your friend. And also be careful, diplomacy is different than just saying, you know, how you feel or what you see. So they both give some pretty good advice there. I did have the pleasure to meet and spend some time with Jerry Newport. We were both speaking at a conference one time, and he shared with me on the plane many of his thoughts, and then asked me to have dinner with him. And at that time, this was, I think it was in 2001, he was finishing his book, Your Life Is Not a Label, and I was writing my book, Right Address, Wrong Planet. And we had a very, very interesting conversation at dinner. I know the waiter, though, was very perplexed and kept looking and looking at us like I don't think could quite understand the relationship. Jerry spoke rather loudly, had a little bit of difficulty modulating his voice, and when he spoke to me, and he was very polite, but when he spoke to me, he didn't look at me, he looked past me, and there wasn't that direct eye contact, and so our conversations did look a little bit different. Jerry, in his book, talks about, and he shared this with me too, he says, if I had to give two-word description of us, meaning people with Asperger syndrome, I'd say we're lousy jugglers. We just have a hard time multitasking. And he says, my peers, though, see beauty and order where others see nothing. And I just think I am, he said, I just think I am able and incompetent in a skewed, very different way, but I am not disabled. And he is impassionate about you are so much more than your label. His book gives really good advice for teens on the spectrum and young adults, and he tries to give advice of things that he's experienced that maybe we can help others to avoid by sharing some of those insights. He also said life was like being in an ocean, constantly treading water. I thought that was a really good analogy, just trying to keep your head above water. And he said most people buy spreadsheet packages from Microsoft. People like Temple Grandin and Kim Peek. Kim Peek was the gentleman who Dustin Hoffman watched and followed to be able to make the movie Rain Man. And he said the three of them were born with spreadsheets, packages in their heads. That's just how they think. Jerry told me some interesting things, too. It turns out that he grew up in Central Islip on Long Island, and I grew up in Brentwood, Long Island, many, many years ago. And he's a few years older than I am. And our towns that we lived in were right next to each other. We found this out 10 years ago. He started quoting all of the high school sports statistics from my high school, which I wasn't aware of. But he had kept track of that all these years and was just talking. He was fascinating, some of the things he really remembered. He also said, I thought this was a very interesting comment, we get so caught up in the distress of the moment that every pothole in the street seems to swallow us up because we never see far ahead to avoid them. And he's repeated that in several of his different presentations, and even talking to me on the plane. He talked about one of his jobs, he was a taxi driver. I don't remember if it was for a pizza store or something, and also likened the potholes in the road and dodging and all that kind of stuff to kind of how a lot of his life had actually gone, the emotional part of his life. This is really interesting. A person had said to him, Jerry, you have to make a conscious effort to do what the rest of us do naturally, which is so true. Many of us are not taught explicitly just some of the hidden curriculum and the things that are so important to get along in life. And little did that person know, I believe this was said way before he ever got a diagnosis, that that's what he was going to need to do. So the transition to adulthood. We already know that adolescence and adulthood can be a challenging time of transition for many individuals, not just people with Asperger syndrome and high-functioning autism. There are new social demands. We're looking at going from school to work, or perhaps high school to college and then to work. We're looking at sexual relationships. We're looking at leaving home. And it's especially challenging for people with Asperger syndrome. Digby Tantum from England has said the mildness of the handicap in Asperger syndrome is what makes its emotional and social impact so severe. I get upset when I hear people talking about, Asperger syndrome is just high-functioning autism, or it's just on the mild end of autism. Yeah, it might be on the mild end if you're looking strictly at IQ, perhaps, but that just is so misleading because it is extremely socially disabling conditioning and can impact people tremendously. And that is overlooked when we say mildness. Typically right now when we're talking about high-functioning autism versus low-functioning autism, we would say people with Asperger syndrome are on the high-functioning autism spectrum because it's a wide spectrum, from people who maybe have no language and have extreme sensory issues and don't interact with people and low measured IQs if that is assessed, compared to people who are geniuses and holding high-level, technological jobs. So it is a wide spectrum, and yes, people with Asperger syndrome would be on the higher end, but all higher on the high-level end is referring to as IQ, and there's so much more important in life than just IQ. There's the ability to adapt socially and emotionally, and those are the key aspects that are missing when we say individuals with Asperger syndrome are high-functioning, because they are challenged in the social emotional areas. And sometimes the mildness of it is can be so damaging because we're assuming that the person is evenly developed. I know I've been guilty of this with my son. His average intelligence, and he sometimes he just seems so intuitive and knows what's going on, and then the other times he doesn't. And you kind of miss that, or you just assume that he gets things he doesn't get or understands things. So I think it's the invisibility, perhaps, of the condition. It doesn't look like a disabling condition at first, is why we call it mild, and yet it's quite socially disabling. A couple of ways that we can work with individuals. A good way is person-centered planning, and there's a lot of research out there on that and the different types of planning that we can do. But essentially, a person-centered plan is where the team meets. It's a team process. There's a neutral facilitator, and they discuss the vision of a positive future and create an action plan towards achieving that goal. It's key that the individual with Asperger syndrome is the person who decides who's to be invited at the meeting. So it's people that are key in that person's life. It could be another church member. It could be someone from the grocery store they go all the time. It could be a neighbor. Lots of people that are important in that person's life. It might not necessarily be for a high school or the school psychologist or someone in the school system that might not really be as connected. It would be community people that they're very connected with. The best time to complete it is when the team is trying to clarify the person's wishes. And typically there's lots of group graphics. In other words, there might be I can't think of the name of it, a board with paper, a flip chart, I think is what I'm thinking of, with markers. And you're going to map out what is your vision, where do you see yourself. When this was done for my son for the first time, when he was 22, and they brought in a neutral facilitator who had done this many times, and the people who were working with my son at that time weren't as familiar with the process, so they brought this gentleman in, who my son did know, and he began to talk about, okay, Brent, where do you want to be 5 years from now? What's your vision? And Brent started to participate and then finally put his hands up, and he said, oh, wait a minute, I can't do this. I don't even know where I'm going to be a year from now, let alone next week. Can we back that down to my vision for a year? So it's important to also get that input. We might have these great grandiose plans, but make sure that the person that we're trying to help is on board with all of this. It's also a time of creative thinking. We can think outside the box. This is not an IEP or individual education plan meeting. There are 5 essential person-centered planning goals according to Kincaid, and these are also sometimes called outcomes or valued accomplishments for the person. And the 5 key ones are that the person be present and participate in community life, that they gain and maintain satisfying relationships, and that they get to express their preferences and make choices in everyday life. They also have the opportunity to feel respected, have respected roles, and to live with dignity. And they continue to develop personal competence. So as you're creating the plan, you're also keeping these goals in mind. In order to be able to do this, though, we also have to teach self-determination skills. And Waymeyer and colleagues have defined self-determination as the set of skills that results in an individual's being the causal agent in his or her life. And this is going to involve the person knowing themselves, which again can be very challenging for someone on the autism spectrum because of theory of mind issues and those types of things. Some are better than others in discerning their own feelings, but this is typically an area of challenge. So teaching them to get to know themselves and their environment and how they can work in their environment. And also another key thing is teaching them to value themselves. There's a lot of really good skills that they have and focusing on that. And then teaching them to plan, act on the plan, and then experience those outcomes and learn from it. That's all part of self-determination, pretty complex. Other components that other researchers have listed of self-determination components are goal setting and attaining that goal, choice making, problem solving, teaching the person how to problem solve and joining them in that. Teaching decision making. Many times these individuals have not had the chance to do this. We've done so many things for them under the guise of supports, but yet we haven't maybe helped them to be as independent as possible. And that's why starting when they're young, like with visual supports, is seriously one evidence-based way of helping individuals to become more independent. Not having to rely on us all the time to ask questions and solve things. Teaching self-regulation, knowing things about their own body, where their emotions are, how to inhibit impulses, knowing about their sensory issues. And their student-directed learning skills. How do they learn? Having an understanding of that. Learning self-advocacy, speaking up for themselves. Having a perception of efficacy and control. And also self-awareness and self-knowledge, which sometimes we'll call metacognition, or knowing about their own knowing. How do they learn and know about themselves? So it can be quite intensive. There's a lot of things really involved. It's a lot of direct, explicit instruction in these areas. Key thing to know is that the adult services are so different than what the individual has experienced all through their public school years, whether they graduate at age 18 or stay in school to age 22. In the local school system, that was the single agency that coordinated services with them in school through the IEP, or Individual Education Plan or Program team. But adult services have a whole new set of community resources. Each have different rules and regulations and procedures. And that's if you stay in your own state. If you move to another state, which we did with our son, then you have a whole different set of rules and things that you need to be looking at. Even some of the agencies, which I'll just talk about in a minute, like vocational services and Social Security, they are federally run programs, but each state then operates, and there are sometimes different rules and different things to know within each state. So adult services are governed by different laws and policies. And one thing, whether you're a parent or a teacher, to be aware of is that vocational rehabilitation services and Social Security Administration would be important agencies to be contacting when you're getting ready for actually the transition out of high school into the world of work or college. So the contact information there for vocational rehab services, which is actually called DRS, or Division of Rehab Services in Virginia, but that is the general email address, and then it's listed. You can do per area to find out the one specifically in your area. Or Social Security Administration is there. Social Security has a red book that they call, with a lot of the rules and things in it. It can be very complex. I felt it was very humbling, even having a PhD, trying to decipher some of the information. There are people at the offices that is their job, to explain some things and help direct. So certainly take advantage of that. Some of the programs through the Social Security Administration are SSI. The rules, though, are different if you're under 18 as to when you're over 18. And so that's when you're under 18, the benefits for that, the supplemental income, is based on the parent's salary, whereas you're over 18, it is different. SSDI is Social Security Disability Insurance. If the individual has worked but is having difficulty working because of their disability, or maybe they have Asperger syndrome but also have a coexisting or comorbid mental health condition like bipolar or depression or something like that, that prevents them from working fully, they might consider applying for SSDI. And then that is based on their work history and their age, what the benefits would be there. There are other programs like Ticket to Work once you're in the system, or the PASS programs, where you can find out lots of information on how to access those things. Personally, we were not thrilled about having our son, because we didn't understand, get in the Social Security system. Just it was lack of ignorance or understanding at first, but there are a lot of misunderstandings out there. One other thing about when you're on Social Security, if you do qualify for a disability, then it's 5 months after you're actually qualified that you would receive any kind of payment for your SSDI payment, and then 2 years from that date you are eligible for Medicare, the medical insurance that adults who are 65 and above qualify for. We did not at first want to pursue that route, because our intention was that our son would be working in a vital part of society and all that, but there were times when that was not possible for him. And so just wanted to make you aware that there are these other options as well. Okay, so then thinking about college, Claire Sandsbury, remember we talked about her earlier, Martian in the Playground, she said for many, college is the first chance to experience formal education as enjoyable and to discover themselves as competent. That was her experience. She said universities are more suited to the learning style of people with Asperger syndrome. And by that, I believe she meant more the individualized research, and that you can follow your pursuits to the nth degree, what you're specifically interested in. In fact, kind of interesting, Tony Atwood, psychologist from Australia who does a lot of work with people with Asperger syndrome, made a comment that college professors, and I am one of them, actually working in a college or a university is the sheltered workshop for professors. And by that, what he was referring to is, where else are you celebrated for and paid to work on your specific perseverative or all-consuming obsessive interests? It's kind of interesting. Thinking about college, the book by Sarita Freeman, and that she wrote that in 2010. It's a very easy read and gives you some good ideas about if you're thinking of college, some things to consider and some suggestions and some strategies. First of all, you want to think about, is it the right choice to go or not? For some, it's perhaps not. In our family, we'd always talked about college, and my husband and I had gone, and education was important, and our son kind of followed suit. In hindsight, I don't know that that was the best decision for him at the time. He had a lot of challenges, and in the end, he wound up actually finishing a certificate program at Vatterott College that was more specific towards computer repair, and that might have been a better route for him to choose initially. But we did not know at that time. You want to know, is the person ready to leave home or not? Perhaps they're going to do college online or locally in a community college or something like that. If they go away to college, are they going to have a roommate or get a single room? These are things to consider. Are they going to go part-time or full-time study? And what kind of college? Community, large or small? There are advantages to all of these and disadvantages, or an online university. Some of the skills to be successful in college, I thought this comment was so poignant. Being smart just is not enough. And I actually had a parent just say that to me recently. Her son was at our college, had Asperger syndrome, and just figured that fact that he's so bright that would carry him through, and that he was having many, many social challenges. The sole focus in high school, though, has been on academics, and Freeman contends that that's a disservice, that we really, even though these individuals are typically bright, at least average intelligence and some much higher, that's what we focus on, are the academics, and that we really need to give them instruction on daily living skills and independence. So there are a lot of programs actually now coming up that are looking at that, like transition programs before college, and even colleges that are instituting extra special supports for individuals with Asperger syndrome. So some of the college skill sets that Freeman says we need are self-awareness, some environmental skill sets, self-advocacy, organizational, asking for help and self-care, and social skills, and I'll talk about each one briefly. Self-awareness is the self-acceptance of your own weaknesses and your strengths. This becomes challenging because the individual with Asperger syndrome sometimes will say, but I don't have that, or their parents might, or other people, because it's almost, again, like an invisible disability. You don't always see it quite obviously at first until you're engaged maybe in a more conversation that you're trying to be reciprocal. You also want to look at, does the person want to disclose this? To get services on a college campus, you have to disclose it if you want to access some accommodations. The other issue is no two people with Asperger syndrome are alike. So the services one person's going to need is not the same as the other, and sometimes these things are hard to determine. The person needs to recognize their own physical and emotional states, and that is really difficult. Remember, theory of mind types of issues. They have difficulty understanding their own emotions. Peter Satmari wrote an article and said there are some individuals, high-functioning individuals, who don't recognize the physical symptoms of when they're very depressed or perhaps have suicide ideation, and the only way to treat it is through medication. But hopefully many are able to recognize that through some cognitive behavioral therapy approaches so that they can go to ask for help themselves. Knowing about self-regulation management, knowing whether you're hungry or thirsty. Sometimes those your own physical, emotional states they're not even aware of and could wind up missing meals and feeling sick and not realizing. I know of a college student who was having digestive difficulties with constipation, and decided to remedy that by eating a complete bag of prunes. Went into extreme pain, didn't know what to do, was just doubled over and called the police. And of course, that went into the local police record on the college campus. And again, that would be an issue of just not knowing maybe where to get help from or who to call at that time, go into the health center. So the last point on the slide there is recognizing the points of getting help. The person got that, but knowing when, where, and from who. Those are other things that need to be explicitly taught. Self-awareness also involves anxiety, depression, and stress sometimes. Research by the Gazoudians has showed that young adults with Asperger syndrome, the most frequent comorbid or coexisting condition is depression, and then followed by anxiety and bipolar type things. For younger children, the most frequent coexisting condition is ADHD. So you want to consider the following. If you're in crisis, the person needs to know they have to call the doctor immediately. Maybe they need to be taught deep breathing or progressive relaxation, maybe for some yoga or counseling. There's some interesting things being done with counseling as well. I know of some individuals with Asperger syndrome who were in formal talk therapy with their counselors and then went away to college, and they were able to talk to their therapist online. You got to think of the confidentiality issues and stuff involved, but that was a medium to keep up with just some of the things and actually to still get some benefit out of some of those services. Mental health treatment, this is Valerie Gaz's book. She said that the most common reasons adults, in her experience and research, sought treatment was because of social isolation and loneliness, and second for depression. And what she does in her cognitive behavioral therapy approaches is teach new cognitive behavioral skills that the person had never learned. And then also teaches compensatory strategies for the deficits or weaknesses that cannot be changed. We can sometimes compensate for those things. And she also talked, very important to facilitate self-acceptance and to teach strategies to decrease or prevent symptoms from becoming more comorbid mental health conditions. She also talked about treatment should always include helping the person to be aware of things already done to successfully adapt, to build on those strengths. In other words, remind them and constantly tell them about the things they have been so successful with, because they're so used to hearing the things they haven't been. And in analyzing the cognitive distortions, and particularly for this population, is that all or nothing or black and white thinking that's the most common. So she recommends having the person monitor and record their thoughts, and then you look to see where the breakdown is and where the distortions and illogical thinking actually is. I can't get my slide to go down. Try again. Okay. Some of the environmental skills, create routines and predictability, and balance sameness with flexibility. That can be really, really challenging, but we want to be incorporating both. And you might want to consider the HIPAA release for parents to participate in the medical care, even of their adult child, when they're at college. And also dealing with sensory issues. The person might need to know that when I'm in a classroom, the auditory things that are bothering me, perhaps I need to wear lightweight earphones, but not enough that it blocks out the lecture, anything like that. Also, if the visual things are challenging, or fluorescent lights, maybe sitting away from those. I know actually at our campus, we actually had to change out fluorescent lights in one of the classrooms because it was so challenging for a student. Some of the other things are understanding that issues with tactile. The student might need to have a space where they sit where they're not, maybe that close to others, or also be aware of the fact that they like certain clothes but they can't wear them every single day. Again, we want to look at these environmental skills to teach independence is what we're looking at. And then next, we want to look at I'm losing my slides. Let's see. Self-advocacy skills. Is the person going to disclose their disability? Stephen Shore does a lot of work on this, when it's important to do that and not. And that's an individual decision. We've had difficulty with our son, and we've talked to some experts. When do we disclose and when not? We typically did disclose, but there are a couple times when it was felt maybe that wasn't the best. That's something you definitely want to look at. But again, on the college level, if you're not disclosing, you're not going to be able to get the services for accommodations. You want to understand your own learning style and your needs. You want to be able to ask for accommodations if you need them. In high school, you didn't necessarily need to do that. It was built into your IEP plan. In college, you're not going to get them unless you ask for them. And then you need to know what it is you need to ask for. And that was the hardest for my son. He didn't know what he needed to ask for. You want to learn to increase the motivation for non-preferred tasks, and that's probably something that individuals will struggle with for the rest of their lives. And find out about the grading system. How does that work? So it's not a surprise. Kind of laughed when I wrote this information from Freeman, because I thought all college students that I'm teaching now really need this. This isn't just for Asperger syndrome. And learning to work in groups can be extremely challenging. Want to consider if the students are allowed to pick their own groups, sometimes the student with Asperger syndrome will be left out. So incorporating the teacher in that decision may be helpful. Organizational skills, definitely learning how to use a planner to keep appointments. Answering emails. People don't like to answer them, whereas typically that is usually the preferred mode, texting and emailing. But again, individuals are all different. They need to learn to be able to manage their own personal documents and possessions so that they can find them when they need them. Need to learn how to see the big picture or develop high-level meaning in tasks. And that would, again, go to central coherence challenges. They need to develop routines for study and leisure. And again, as I'm reading these, I'm reminded, actually, these benefit all college students. And learn to plan for possible changes. And again, you can teach this when the children are young by gently sabotaging a situation and changing the routine to help them to understand, oh, we have a surprise today, this is what we're going to do. And also learning the library resource strategies. Again, this applies to all students, but they're going to need to know how to do that to be successful in college. Other organization skills involve executive functioning skills, and we talked about that earlier. That involves the prefrontal cortex of the brain and knowing how to plan. So can the person initiate? And to initiate, they have to first be alert and aware of their options, then respond to their internal and external cues, and then evaluate the choices, and then act. Very, very complex skill of initiation. Planning and organizing. How are they going to develop a system to know where things are? Are they going to have some kind of file system? Self-monitoring, actually checking their own behavior and recording it and then monitoring to see how they're doing. Problems with working memory. This is where you hold things briefly in your mind so that you can work on it and manipulate the data. This can be extremely difficult for people on the autism spectrum. So we need to help them to learn how to manipulate that in their head and perhaps write things down so that they can do that. Shifting gears is difficult because remember we said they had trouble with that and trouble with theory of mind. So we might teach them to learn how to rank order behaviors, like ranking subtle, something that's subtle to more subtle to less subtle so that they can see those comparisons. And response inhibition, that was the most difficult and still is for our son, learning when to not say things. One of his girlfriends in the past said, why don't you, instead of having something just fall out of your mouth, share it with me first, and she could be his filter. Asking for help skills, realizing the role of others in your life, knowing who to ask and when, and what they can do to help you. Learning a sense of reciprocity or the give and take or sharing of things, and that's involved in learning turn-taking as a younger person and conversation. Acknowledging when assistance is needed and learning who to ask for. Also gaining emotional, social, and safe support. And learning personal safety. Some self-care skills are the basic psychological needs of hygiene, showering daily, what to do. I do know of some students who will just say, well, I took a shower this week, and really very serious that then we might not have to do that anymore. Actually, for a young adult who did that, a social story that was very successful was written, and it focused on the science of sweat and why, a colleague of mine wrote it, and why it's important. And it took a very scientific medical approach, and that was the way, again, to approach that student, and that was effective, and that he was able to change his habits. Knowing laundry. My son used to say he could put the laundry in, but he'd forget about it for a week and go back, and it would be in a ball somewhere or kind of molded. Someone else took it out. Shopping, buying your own food and clothes, money management. Medication management can be a real issue too, especially if the person's a little reticent to taking the medicine because maybe they like the way they feel if they have also, comorbid bipolar issues, and it might be very important that they do take their medicine. Maybe they need to know about public transportation, or perhaps they have their own car and then they need to know about personal car maintenance and things like that. So it's very complex, the skills that they're going to need to be a successful young adult. Social skills, we know that they have problems with social cognition or social intelligence or awareness, so we need to directly teach that. A lot of times we can do that through the skills that we talked about in an earlier webcast on supports for people with Asperger syndrome, and that would involve perhaps social stories, comic strip conversations, charting things out, visual supports, if-then consequence charts, those types of things. Teaching how to have friendships, what a true friend of reciprocity is. Not everybody who looks at you or says hi is your friend. Teaching explicitly how to recognize nonverbal cues. We know that so much of what we say, I think it's about 55% of the emotional content in our messages is by our facial expressions, and the other 37% or 38% is by the tone of our voice. Excuse me. So all that's going to impact how a person understands what they're hearing besides just the words. Having to know what the classroom rules and expectations are. That syllabus in college is really important. I'm just amazed even at students not on the spectrum who don't seem to realize that, but really explaining that. And emotional reactions to peers and professors. If a professor is sarcastic, which might not be appropriate, but teaching the person with Asperger's syndrome how to maybe appropriately respond or react to that and to react to their peers. Other social skills at this age are dating, sexual education, focusing on safe sex and the issue with STDs and things like that. Theory of mind skills still need to be worked on, and that would be, you'd start that when they're very, very young, but reviewing that again, trying to teach them to put themselves in another person's shoes and what those things might feel like. Also teaching about exploitation of being taken advantage of. There's a pretty good clip on a YouTube clip from the National Autistic Society, NAS, in England, that is on bullying specifically, and they interview adults, young adults, who were bullied as children and how they allowed people to take advantage and how painful that was. And they're having programs making that aware to prevent that, because it is a major problem with this population. Actually, it's a major national problem anyway. But then Wolf, Brown, and Bork wrote a book which is very good. It's in your reference list as well, and they said they have found their disability, they work in disability services at college, and they found that for students with Asperger's syndrome, parental involvement is sometimes essential to success. And you've got to weigh that out, how to do that, because remember, at age 18, if there's no guardianship involved, the person with Asperger's syndrome makes their own decisions. So they have to give permission for their parents to actually be involved and sign for what they're allowed to have access to and not have access. The other thing is employment. Adults with Asperger's syndrome, research has shown, they reported the biggest obstacles in maintaining employment were the poor social communication between the employee and employer or coworkers. My son has certainly experienced this. Their social skills deficits and their sensory issues. And sometimes they're even unaware of the sensory issues. Temple Grandin emphatically talks about how this sensory is a really big deal and we need to look at it. And then Romerser in 2000 was writing an article. He graduated from an Ivy League school with high-functioning autism, and just talked about, he called it malemployment, that typically we on the spectrum are underemployed or not employed. Certainly underemployed for our skill set, or maybe we can't even get jobs or maintain or hold them. Temple Grandin says you really need to do what you do best. You need to find out what that is, and hopefully you have a mentor who would help you with that, and do it. Develop your talents, whatever they are. Get to know your community, where you can use these skills. Develop a plan. Create a portfolio. She said she never would have got a job by going in the office through the personnel office, which is typically how people get jobs, and that she said be prepared to get through the back door, side door, any door, but not the front door, because that's a lot of times where people don't make the job interview, maybe because of the lack of eye contact or the quietness and not the gregariousness and that sort of thing, and yet they might be extremely skilled and a valuable employee for that company, and they don't get past that initial interview. That's why she said to create the portfolio and show that, to represent yourself. Coulter has a video also that's quite good on there, and I have that on your reference. It's called Asperger's Syndrome at Work. Asperger's Syndrome at Work. And you first do a personal assessment. He says, what are your interests? List them. What are your strengths and limitations? List them. How would your strengths and limitations affect the job? What are the requirements, and can you meet those requirements? And actually document that. And then he said, consider working with a job coach. Make a list of reasonable accommodations and try and be as flexible as possible, knowing this is challenging. Try to modify the behaviors that interfere with the job and prepare and practice before you go on a job interview. His DVD also interviews actual employers too. It's quite good. He got involved, Dan Coulter, in all of this to help his son Drew, who's in his he's over about 26, 27 years old now, to help him with college. And then through this whole process of creating these different videos, Dan now says that he also, as an adult, found out much later in life that he has Asperger's syndrome as well. So some employment traits of individuals on the spectrum: they can be extremely reliable, persistent, perfectionistic, technically able, accurate, logical. have great attention to detail, conscientious, original in their problem solving because they can think outside the box. They thrive on clear expectations and routine, are knowledgeable, possess social justice and integrity. But some of the employment issues that they might have are here. This is Jerry Newport commented, "The number one reason that my male peers lose jobs and have legal trouble is from inappropriate behavior, often seen as stalking, but that's not really what it is, but it appears that way. They don't know what they are doing at work or other places, and that gets them in trouble," misinterpreted. And then he goes on to say, flexibility or the lack of it is a big reason why many of us with autism keep getting fired or never doing anything beyond an entry-level job. It is, he said, ironically, a result of our wanting to follow all the rules and to be a great worker. So some of the possible challenges are going to be the teamwork skills. And unfortunately, many of the jobs today involve having good teamwork skills. Well, years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case. Asking for help, handling change, conflict resolution, organizing and planning, and the individuals may be gullible. So knowing these things in advance, we need to plan and to teach. And again, a lot of explicit instruction in these areas. Other possible challenges are, does the person have realistic career expectations? The other thing about that is we really need in our country to be doing more in the area of job development. I mean, we can be creating jobs around some of the unique interests these individuals have. That might be very, very beneficial. But Peter Gerhardt's done a lot of that. There's also a man, from Denmark, I'm trying to think. He has a company called Specialistern, and he created a company that hires people on the spectrum specifically and capitalizes on their strengths. They do a lot of consulting work, a lot of computer technology kind of things, data entry, and he purposely did this because he wants to have a place for his son to work when he gets older. His son was about 7 when he was doing this. And had been diagnosed with autism. And it's pretty amazing. He's taking this model across the world, and it's been pretty successful. Also, there's misinterpretation of instructions on the work site. There are sensory issues, sometimes difficulty accepting advice, sometimes personal hygiene issues. Temple Grandin talks about that was an issue for her, but what happened was the secretary was able to help her and to tell her how to appropriately dress, and she was okay. There's interpersonal problems. Employment, you also must explicitly be taught job requirements that you and I take for granted and don't need explicit instruction on things such as the dress code, when to arrive at work and when to leave, where to clock in and clock out, what's that procedure, where to park, where to enter the facility, how long and where to take lunch and breaks, and where to put your personal belongings. It might sound silly, but these are a lot of things that tripped my son up. They truly did. And we thought, he had these things covered, and they became issues. May explicitly also need to be taught who to talk to about work issues and who not to. The role of unions and human resources. My son just worked for a company that had a union for the first time ever. He misused it. He called to tattle several times, and that didn't work. And we continually talked to him about that wasn't appropriate. That was very, very challenging. How to do the job in detail. What's the probationary period? What's involved? Job performance reviews. How often do they happen? What are the benefits, including vacations and holidays? The Americans Disabilities Act does help and protect individuals from discrimination in all parts of an employment practice, including job application, procedures, hiring, firing, training, pay, promotion, and benefits and leave. But you also have the right, because you have the right to be free from harassment because of your disability, and an employer may not fire or discipline you for asserting your rights under Americans with Disabilities Act or ADA. But most importantly, you have a right to request a reasonable accommodation for the hiring process on the job. So what is a reasonable accommodation? Well, it's very similar to when you were in school earlier. It's individualized, and you can't just say that there are certain accommodations that are for everybody. The definition of it, according to the website, is any modification or adjustment to your job or change in the work environment that enables a qualified applicant with a disability to compete equally or a qualified employee with a disability to perform the essential functions of the position. The accommodation must be job-related and not for personal use, such as the company doesn't need to pay for the person's personal wheelchair or transportation to work or prosthetic devices and hearing aids. Also, the need for reasonable accommodations is determined on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the following considerations: the person's specific disability and existing limitations to the performance of a job function, the essential duties of the job and the work environment, and the feasibility of the proposed accommodation. These accommodations also can be requested on what we call a 504 accommodation plan on the college level for the student going to college. But again, it's only reasonable accommodations that can be made. And those accommodations really are adjusting the academic program or environment, and the intention is to mitigate the impact of the functional limitation of the disability on participation in that specific environment. So basically it's to level the playing field, but it's not to give the person with the disability an unfair advantage. So some possible ones that are used at times are alternate formats books, or extended time on tests, not unlimited time, but extended time, or maybe testing in a separate non-distracting room, or having a note taker. But it is never meant, the academic standards of the college should never change. That would be an unreasonable request. Another example of an unfair request would be requesting an aide to accompany the person with Asperger syndrome to all exams and to clarify all the student answers to a professor. That would be considered unfair, yet certain accommodations could be made to help the person. In other areas, Asperger syndrome talents certainly have changed the world, and although I focused on so many of the deficit areas that we need to do explicit teaching and preparation for, and preparation for transition doesn't begin in 12th grade in high school. It begins as early as the child is 5 years old, and you're starting to prepare. And teaching skills of independence, how to use visual schedules, and how to advocate for yourself. So although we focused on a lot of the deficit areas, I did just want to end with some of the talents that change the world. Now perhaps it's unfair, and I am not making this decision that these people had Asperger syndrome, but in Fitzgerald and O'Brien's book, they give stories about these individuals and say that perhaps they, according to today's definition of Asperger syndrome, these famous people might have had it, and look at how valuable and how they contributed to our society. Isaac Newton, Mendel, Thomas Jefferson, Charles Darwin, Stonewall Jackson, Albert Einstein, and Charles Lindbergh, just to name a few, who they feel might have actually had a lot of the characteristics of Asperger syndrome. The next few slides that you'll have if you print off just give the references to a lot of the resources that I talked about, so you can get more information than you're going to get in this short webcast. Again, I thank you for your time and attention. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.